All right, I'll look first to Ms. Cott. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
Okay, yes,
Great.
thanks.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. It is the afternoon, a little after 1 o'clock on Monday, September 16th. We are convening our afternoon portion of the hearing with respect to the proposed site's reservoir project, and we left off before we took a break for lunch with cross-examination of the authorities panel 6. Do I have the number right? The fisheries panel. By Mr. Busher, and I believe Mr. Busher is still on. So if we could have, I'll ask my team to go ahead and please pin the respective witnesses. And Mr. Busher, I see we already have Mr. Hitchings. There we have it. And with that, I'll turn things back over to you, Mr. Busher.
Thank you, Hearing Officer Kenzie. Ms. Mullen, can we put Baykeeper Exhibit 63 on the screen, please? And Dr. Greenwood, while that's coming up, that's a paper by, sorry, hang on a second. Munch et al. 2020, I believe. Are you familiar with this paper?
I believe so. If you wouldn't mind scrolling through it a little. I know there's a couple of different Munch et al. Papers. Just want to ensure it's the one I'm thinking of. Yes, I'm familiar with this one.
Okay, great. And we can stay on this page. That's where we're headed anyway, so I appreciate that. And previously, we've been talking about academic studies that have analyzed impacts on outmigrating juveniles, smolt, pre-smolt, smolt-sized fish, correct?
The previous studies we were talking about, I believe they were of those life stages you described.
Okay. And this paper by Munch is about fry, primarily smaller, younger Chinook salmon, correct?
I believe that's how they characterize them.
And we've got on the screen figure 3, which is what I wanted to ask you about. The second row of panels there, which is in blue, the blue lines, plot the absence or presence of fry Chinook salmon rearing, or fry Chinook salmon habitat, correct?
Sorry, the second row?
The blue one's correct. We can zoom in on there's 3 blue graphs.
How did you describe it?
So that plots the presence or absence, depending on whether it's positive or negative, I think, of the fry rearing habitat for Chinook salmon, correct?
I believe it's the probability of presence of fry in the sampling year that was used for the study as a function of the different variables that are listed on the horizontal axis.
All right, thank you. Correct. So the middle one there of Sacramento River 30-day mean flow in cubic meters per second shows that function, correct?
It shows the logit presence, which is the vertical axis, as a function of 30-day flow mean in cubic meters per second.
Okay. But that was the function that you just described, right?
That
Of
was
the-
what I summarized.
Okay, thank you. According to Munch et al., does juvenile salmon occupancy of habitats in the delta increase as flows increase on a 30-day flow mean?
Certainly the catches within their sampling gear in this study increase as a function of the flow, Sacramento River flow. I believe this is Sacramento River flow at Freeport, just to clarify.
And thank you, that is correct. I should have said that at the outset. I appreciate the addition. Is it correct that the diversion of water from the Sacramento River when flows at Freeport were less than about 500 cubic meters per second, as reflected in that chart, would be expected to result in a reduction of the places where juvenile Chinook salmon can rear in the delta?
I would say less flow, flow below the 500 cubic meters per second level that you identified, approximately, would have a lower probability of presence of juvenile or Chinook salmon fry, in this case, as they've characterized it within the paper.
Does the proposed prohibition on sites diversion when Wilkins Slough flows are less than 10,700 CFS prevent diversions of water that would result in lower occupancy of these tidal habitats that we just discussed?
I believe it does, to some degree. It's not specifically addressing this Freeport flow explicitly because it's a Wilkins Slough criterion, but analyses that I've done examining the general relationship between Wilkins Slough and Freeport suggest that it would largely limit within this range.
Okay. What analyses are those?
Additional analysis that I did for responding to comments about this issue and for the final environmental impact report.
Do you know where in the FEIR that analysis is contained?
Yes, it would be master response 5. I believe the exhibit is AHO 246.
Thank you. Is it generally correct that based on the results of this paper, the number of fry or juveniles in delta tidal marsh habitats increases with winter and spring outflow at Freeport?
The probability of capture of Chinook salmon fry within the sampling gear used by the study has a higher probability as the flow increases according to the relationship shown on the graph, on the figure that we've been looking at.
Do you disagree with the conclusions in this paper?
Which conclusions?
What you just described.
I was describing the result of the analysis.
Do you disagree with the results that are presented that you just described?
I haven't done an alternative analysis, so I don't disagree.
Okay. Other than what you described in the master response 5, are you aware of any modeling between the relationship between the flows at Freeport and the flows at Wilkins Slough 10,700 and the flows described in this paper at Freeport?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay. And with respect to the other excuse me, with respect to the literature we looked at this morning from kind of Michel through Munch that we just talked about, is it correct that those papers, right, show different correlations between flow and migration of different stages, or I'm sorry, different runs of Chinook salmon at different locations in the river?
Objection, vague and compound.
Sustained. Try that one again, Mr. Busher.
Well, is there any modeling outside of what you described in Master Response 5 that you're aware of that would correlate the flows at Wilkins Slough of 10,700 CFS with any of the other flow results that we talked about in the academic papers this morning at different locations?
Sorry, just to make sure I understand the question. Are you saying are there correlations between Wilkins Slough flows and, for example, Freeport flows, or is that the question?
Yeah, well, so you said when we were talking about Munch and the graph here that there was some analysis of whether the flow threshold at Wilkins Slough would, how it would interact with the flows that are described in Munch's paper at Freeport. And I want to know if there's any analysis, and you pointed to Master Response 5 for that, and that is helpful. I appreciate that. I want to know if there's any analysis outside of Master Response 5 that you're aware of that correlates those flows at Wilkins Slough, 10,700, with any of the other flows at the other locations that we talked about in the papers this morning, right? Bend Bridge or in the Delta, whatever those may have been. Or is that any analysis? Am I going to find all of that in Master Response 5, or is there anywhere else I should look?
What I mentioned was specific to the correlation of Wilkins Slough to Freeport, as we see in which is, I think, relevant for this paper. I don't recall if there's any other correlative analysis between Wilkins Slough flow and other locations in the Sacramento River.
In Master Response 5 or elsewhere that you're relying on for your opinions?
I'm not aware of any location of the specific correlation.
Okay. And other than that correlation or analysis about the correlation that you just described, is it accurate to say that the flow result from Michel is the only one that was used as a criteria for diversion for Sykes Reservoir?
That is the paper that was used to establish the 10,700 CFS criterion. Our overall assessment of the project's potential effects includes a number of different flow survival relationships.
But there's no other criteria that come from any of those other papers or those analysis of those flow survival relationships, correct?
There are other criteria for the project, bend bridge, pulse flow protection.
Okay.
Criteria. That wasn't specific to papers that I had mentioned or that we had been discussing this morning. So the Wilkins Slough 10,700 CFS was specifically related to the Michel et al. Paper we discussed.
Thank you. Generally, Dr. Greenwood, is it accurate that juveniles need shallow, slow-moving environments to rear and grow before they are prepared to migrate to the ocean?
Juvenile
Objection,
salmon.
vague.
Yes, juvenile salmon. Salmon.
Which, Mr. Hitchings? Which part is vague?
Salmon in general, juvenile location in the system.
All right, Mr. Busher, can you be more specific?
Yeah, I'm happy to restate the question.
Great.
So, Dr. Greenwood, do juvenile Chinook salmon need shallow, slow-moving habitat environments and habitats in which to rear, grow, and mature before they migrate to the ocean?
I would say that the habitat suitability of such habitats may be higher than it is relative to, for example, higher velocity. Well, I'm sorry, I forget the exact way that you described it, but what I'm trying to express is that the suitability of the habitat may be higher with some of those characteristics that you described relative to habitat that had different characteristics. So I think the question was relating to need. The habitat can become more suitable, exhibiting some of those characteristics, but fish can rear in a variety of different habitats.
Do you think that the availability of rearing habitat for juvenile Chinook salmon is a limiting factor for the population?
It may be in some cases.
Do you believe it is for, excuse me, Chinook salmon populations that migrate from the Sacramento River through the Delta, a limiting factor for those fish?
Certainly there's less habitat than there has been historically. With respect to limiting, it would likely depend on the abundance of juveniles relative to the amount of habitat that's available.
Does that include riparian and wetland bench habitats?
To some degree, it may.
Do juvenile Chinook salmon use wetland and riparian bench habitats for rearing as they prepare to migrate from the Sacramento River to the ocean?
I believe there's evidence for that.
Do you agree that the CITES project will result in reduced riparian and wetland bench habitat?
Based on our analyses, that's the case, and also the reason for proposed mitigation for that type of effect.
Okay. Can we look at AHO 178, please? So, Dr. Greenwood, this is Appendix 11J from, I believe, the final environmental impact report. And if we could go to page 22, table 11J5. Thank you. Is this the destruction? I'm sorry. Is this the reduction in riparian habitat that you just described as a result of the CITES project?
This is an analysis that looked at that potential effect.
Okay.
The results of that, the results of the analysis, a summary of the results of the analysis.
And the third row of the data in the chart shows Sacramento River above Hood. How far above does that go?
I believe that's looking at the this is focused on the delta, so I believe that's going up to approximately the northern upstream limit of the legal delta. I'd have to look at there is a map, I believe, in this appendix that would give more detail on what it's discussing.
Yeah, so if we could go to page 11, I think that's the map you're referring to. Is this the map you're describing, Dr. Greenwood?
That's the one.
Okay, and does this refresh your recollection as to where that measurement from above hood begins?
Yes, above hood on this is described by the yellow gold symbols.
And so the reduction in bench habitat starts at the top of this map, basically, right? That section from above hood goes from the top of the map to hood.
The analysis of the potential reduction in bench habitat considers all the sites here, whether it's reduction or not. Really depends on the characteristics of the different sites involved.
And if we go back to table 11, J5 on page 22, the first answer you gave me about the bench habitat was that there was mitigation proposed. Does that mitigation construct or create additional bench habitat in other locations or in any of these locations?
I would have to verify the description of the mitigation measure, which is something that's from the California Endangered Species Act incidental take permit application that's associated with this, just to verify. I don't recall offhand what it is as far as location.
I'm sorry. Okay. Is the mitigation to construct or create additional bench habitat?
That's part of what I would need to verify.
Okay. And I assume the same answer in terms of how much bench habitat would be created.
Yes, I don't recall it offhand. Just generally, it was several acres, I believe, but I would have to look at the measure again just to recognize what it actually was.
And do you have can you give me a shorthand for how acres translate to linear feet, since the potential reduction is analyzed in linear feet?
Yes. Basically, it was assumed, I believe, a width. I'd have to actually double check. I think it's then footnoted in the description of the mitigation measure, but I believe there was a distance assumed to translate the linear footage to acreage.
And that's an assumed width of the bench, basically?
That's correct.
Okay. And are there any mitigation measures that you're aware of that sites has agreed to comply with that are not part of the ITP application with respect to the bench habitat question?
I believe mitigation measure for bench was just relating to the ITP application for full mitigation under the California Endangered Species Act.
going to shift gears now to impacts on longfin smelt. And Dr. Grimmett, I don't know if that means I'm continuing to talk with you or not, but whoever the appropriate witness is, I'm going to talk about that now. You understand that longfin smelt is now officially listed as an endangered species federally, correct?
I understand that.
Do you agree that the biggest driver of longfin smelt populations is changes to delta outflow in the winter and the spring?
Objection. Lacks foundation, assumes facts not in evidence.
Can you rephrase that question, Mr. Busher?
Dr. Greenwood, are you generally familiar with, are you an expert on, does your expertise encompass longfin smelt?
It does.
Okay. Does part of that expertise encompass impacts on longfin smelt populations?
To some degree, yes, it's generally within the scope of impact analyses, such as I've been involved with for this project and others.
Okay. Do you agree that the biggest driver of longfin smelt population changes is of longfin smelt populations is changes to delta outflow in the winter and spring?
I believe it's
Again, objection lacks foundation. It's being stated as an underlying fact.
I think, Mr. Busher, can you rephrase the question as Dr. Greenwood
Sure.
believes? There's ways.
Dr. Greenwood, Dr. Greenwood, is the largest driver of longfin smelt population changes to delta outflow in the winter and spring.
I believe it may be a contributing factor among others, but I would hesitate to rank the factors.
Do you agree that the amount of delta outflow influences those other factors?
There may be some factors that are influenced by delta outflow, and others may not.
Can you identify any factors that you think meaningfully impact populations of longfin smelt that are not influenced by delta outflow?
Could you clarify what you mean by meaningfully?
In your view, have a meaningful impact on an endangered fish population?
I think it may vary depending on which factor. I believe predation is one of the factors, which depending on the species involved may not be correlated with flow, as an example.
Okay. Any other examples?
I would have to look at the lists of stressors that we've compiled to be able to assess which ones are which stressors and the potential link to flow.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, can we pull up Baykeeper Exhibit 124, please? Dr. Greenwood, what Ms. Mullen is pulling up is the 2022 draft rule published by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Federal Register related to longfin smelt. You're generally familiar with the proposed rule or the existence of it?
I'm generally familiar with it.
We could go to page 7 of the PDF, please, Ms. Mullen. In the middle column, in the middle of the page, Dr. Greenwood, do you see the bold header, threats influencing the Bay Delta longfin smelt?
I see it.
Okay. And if we could scroll down just a little bit, so we can see that whole paragraph. So the first half of that paragraph identifies various factors that influence Bay Delta longfin smelt, correct?
It does.
And do you have any additional factors that you think need to be added to the list there that are material to the population?
I've seen mention in the past also of incidental bycatch in bay fisheries,
Okay.
shrimp fisheries. Otherwise, I believe these appear to generally describe the main ones I'm somewhat familiar with.
Okay. That paragraph continues after the list of activities. We, being the Fish and Wildlife Service, consider reduced and altered freshwater flows resulting from human activities and impacts associated from current climate change conditions as the main threat facing the Bay Delta longfin smelt due to the importance of freshwater flows to maintaining the life history functions and species needs. Do you agree with that assessment?
I'm not sure about the main threat aspect of it. Certainly, the stressors that they are referencing within the sentence are stressors based on information I've seen. But again, I would be hesitant to try and rank the different stressors.
Okay. And then if we continue down the last few lines of the paragraph here, the impact of many of the other threats identified above are influenced by the amount of freshwater flow into the system. Do you agree with that?
Well, there are certainly, for example, correlations with food availability that I've seen for particularly zooplankton prey for longfin smelt that I've analyzed correlations for with delta outflow more than inflow. I think earlier we discussed regarding water temperatures. So I think there's aspects of it that I would say are correct, but there is some nuance to the general description.
Excuse me, Dr. Greenwood, there's been testimony from other panels that on an average annual basis, the site's project will result in a reduction of total delta outflow. Would you expect that reduction to have an impact on the population of longfin smelt?
An average annual basis is a fairly coarse measurement in terms of hypotheses regarding what may be driving longfin smelt life history. So I would be cautious about saying specifically related to overall average annual delta outflow, I believe you said. We have analyzed focusing in specifically on the different months that are hypothesized to be important in the winter spring for longfin smelt. And so on the basis of that, I think I describe it in my testimony, the evidence for the potential negative effects.
You agree that the analysis in the final EIR shows reductions in abundance relative to the no action alternative are more likely in each water year type for longfin smelt?
The analysis suggests potential negative effects, and I believe we summarize the probability of there being a reduction in the abundance index based on the correlation of the statistical model, or several statistical models that we use. So those show slightly how would I describe it? Slightly above above 0.5, slightly above 0.5 probability of there being a negative effect where we've analyzed it that way.
And small percentage-based reductions as compared to the no action alternative as well, where you analyzed it that way, correct?
Looking at differences in, for example, the mean estimates from the statistical models.
And when you say there's a more than 50% chance that there will be a reduction, that means more likely than not, impact of the project will be to reduce abundance of longfin smelt, correct?
It's marginally more likely.
But more likely, correct?
More likely, but marginally.
Okay. Do you think that expected declines in longfin smelt will result in an increase or decrease of the risk of the species extinction?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Do you think that the expected declines in abundance of longfin smelt documented in the final EIR are likely to increase or decrease the risk of the species extinction?
I'm not sure that it's a decline per se. It's a potential reduction relative to a different scenario, the no action alternative. Based on based on the analysis that we've done, that doesn't suggest that there would be increasing the risk necessarily of extinction.
Is it accurate then to say that your opinion is that a potential reduction in the population of longfin smelt would not increase the risk of the species extinction?
It's a small difference that we estimated. Therefore, I don't believe that it would be much of a difference in that risk, if any.
Can we go to Baykeeper? Apologize, give me a second here. One 115. Sorry. Dr. Greenwood, this is the species status assessment for the San Francisco Bay longfin smelt, distinct population segments from, I believe, I'll tell you, from 2022. You're generally aware of this document?
I'm generally aware of it.
And if we could go to PDF page 88, please. In the second paragraph that begins the current condition, the third sentence starts our meta-analysis. Do you see that section, Dr. Greenwood?
I see it.
So the conclusion from the status assessment in 2022 was that the probability of quasi-extinction exceeds 20% for all survey time series over the next 5 years and reaches 50% by 2040, correct?
That's what that says.
Right. Your opinion is that a decrease in abundance of longfin smelt as a result of the CITES project would have no impact on that risk?
I haven't specifically assessed in relation to these criteria.
Does reading that sentence today change your testimony that you gave previously that the impacts would be so small as to not have an increased risk of extinction?
This doesn't, I mean, this is describing trends. I can't say without, I couldn't say without specifically analyzing it in this framework.
Okay, let me try it this way. Do you think in order to avoid this population going extinct, its abundance needs to increase?
That's a conclusion that could be reached from this.
Is that one you reach from this?
It's a little challenging as I'm really looking at it in detail just now, but it could be.
Do you agree that a potential reduction in the abundance of longfin smelt as a result of operations of the site's reservoir would make increasing the abundance of the species more difficult?
If it did, it would be very limited.
Fair enough. Did you have involvement in the identification or analysis of the mitigation efforts related to longfin smelt?
I did.
And can you generally describe how the project proposes to mitigate the impacts of the potential reduction in abundance that we just went through?
There's a couple of different elements there. As far as actual mitigation measure, there's tidal habitat restoration that's proposed, and that's described in the section of the ITP application that I cross-referenced from my testimony. More broadly, beyond just mitigation considerations, there's also the requirement that the site's project not be operated in a way that adversely affects the ability of others to meet specific criteria, for example, relating to delta outflow.
Okay. With respect to the tidal habitat, do you know how much tidal habitat is proposed or restoration is proposed?
I would have to look at the specific section of the document to refresh my memory. There's different values depending on the scenarios involved. I think the EIR alternative 3 may be slightly different than the ITP application's value.
Okay. Do you know how that amount of mitigation was calculated?
I do.
How was that done?
It's described in more detail in the final EIR and ITP application, but generally speaking, it was relating the export to inflow ratio for the months of February to June as a function to essentially the area of habitat that may be affected within the delta, consistent with prior use of that method for such mitigation.
And is that mitigation or that export inflow or import ratio related to entrainment or the entrainment risk for longfin smelt?
It's partly related to entrainment risk, as well as entrainment, I believe, of food items, but also, generally speaking, is considered in relation to outflow effects or habitat availability. The origin of the method was relating, I would say, more to entrainment.
Okay. Is entrainment expected to increase, of longfin smelt expected to increase substantially under site's operations?
Not based on the analyses that we have done.
And so the decline that is the potential reduction in abundance, as you put it, related to longfin smelt is not because of increased entrainment, correct?
It would be differences in delta outflow have that potential effect.
So I appreciate that the delta outflow impacts the longfin smelt in lots of different ways, including with respect to entrainment. But for sites specifically, your analysis was there is no increased risk of entrainment, even given reduction in delta outflow, correct?
Well, what the analysis, our analysis looked at potential entrainment in several different, or entrainment risk in several different ways. We considered the timing of the diversion of sites reservoir water at the South Delta, which doesn't overlap with the period of concern for entrainment of longfin smelt. But we also looked at potential drivers of entrainment risk in terms of the distribution of longfin smelt, early life stages, which didn't show large effects, and this would be the delta outflow, potential changes in delta outflow because of sites diversions. So that didn't show large differences, but we also noted that there are existing regulatory criteria for South Delta with relation to longfin smelt, entrainment risk that would be in place that would limit the risk of increase from sites. And also I mentioned in my testimony the requirement that the site's operations don't affect the ability of State Water Project, Central Valley Project to be able to meet those entrainment risk criteria.
Do longfin smelt typically live in restored tidal marsh habitats?
They occur in a number of locations. They do occur within restored marshes based on studies that I've seen.
And is that specific life stages that occur in those restored marshlands of longfin smelt?
I'm not recalling the specific life stages that are within those types of habitat based on studies. I've seen some studies speaking of, well, I should qualify that. I've seen studies talking about analogous habitats that weren't necessarily restored that speak to larvae. But for studies that I'm recalling as far as restored habitats, I don't recall the which all life stages are present.
And then I want to shift species one more time and talk for a few minutes here about green sturgeon. Dr. Greenwood, is that you again?
It depends whether it's within delta, or if it's upstream, then it would be more likely to be Mr. Wilder. But if it's, sorry, Dr. Wilder, but if it's near field effects upstream, then it would be me.
All right. So I have some questions about the entrainment impacts. So let's start there. Dr. Wilder, is that you or?
Is it entrainment at near field in the Sacramento
Upstream.
River? Or
Yes.
Okay, that would be my analysis. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Greenwood. I appreciate that. Do you agree that entrainment of green sturgeon is a threat to the population?
It is a threat in as much as I believe we have evidence of it occurring, and so it is negatively affecting green sturgeon to some degree.
Okay. And is it correct that there is currently no criteria for screening that is designed to protect green sturgeon?
I'm not aware of any criteria that are, for example, fish or fish/resource agency criteria such as exist for other species like Chinook salmon fry. I'm not aware of those. I'm aware of criteria that have been suggested within scientific studies.
Is it correct that most of the current screening criteria that exist were developed for salmonids, fry or smolts, as you refer to?
Are you specifically meaning criteria within California?
I guess I would say criteria that could be applied that would have an impact on the Bay Delta species that we're talking about.
There are some that are specific to salmonids, and there are some that are specific to, I'm aware of some that are specific to Delta smelt.
Okay. So your understanding that the screening, either in effect or proposed by sites, is based on the criteria that are specific to salmonids?
That's my understanding.
Okay. Do you agree that those current screening criteria may not be useful in preventing green sturgeon from impingement or entrainment?
They may not in some cases, and we've tried to analyze based on what we know of the screening criteria relative to what's suggested in terms of criteria for sturgeon. So in our impact analysis, the scientific studies I mentioned that have some criteria for sturgeon, those they're expressed as approach velocities essentially, and so they give different months of the year, different criteria, which reflect the different susceptibility, if you like, to screen effects such as those that you mentioned in the question. And so based on that analysis, we were able to focus in on the specific months of where the existing criteria based on salmonid requirements would be perhaps greater than the criteria suggested by the scientific studies, which were generally, if I recall, I think I cited this in my testimony, the spring, April, May, perhaps, illustrating limited differences between the scenarios, given that under the existing no action alternative, that's about the time when the diversions begin for irrigation purposes relative to the site's proposed operations.
Okay. Do you agree that green sturgeon spawn upstream and downstream of the proposed points of diversion for the sites project?
I believe that's correct. I would have to verify, but I believe that's correct.
And do you have a sense, can you describe when it is that juveniles migrate downstream, right, relative to when they were hatched?
Dr. Wilder may have to refresh my memory, but I believe it's they may be more upstream for several months and then be moving downstream after that. So if the hatching is round about the spring or slightly earlier, then it would be several months after that. But if Dr. Wilder has more information than that, that would be good to hear as well.
No, I generally agree with that. Summer, fallish.
Okay. Are you aware of evidence showing that juvenile green sturgeon may remain in upstream in the river for as long as 2 years? Either one of you.
That I don't recall specifically, but it may be true. I don't know. Dr. Wilder, do you have more?
Yes, I believe it's true.
Okay. And so for those that remain right, at the longer end of that time frame, they would be potentially impacted by diversions for an extended period of time, correct?
Yes, depending on where they are, right?
Were you meaning near field effects or?
Correct. Upstream impacts, right? The impingement or diversion or entrainment from those diversions, right? The longer they are in that upper reach of river near where those diversions are occurring, the more likely they are to experience impacts from those, correct?
Well, I think the period of vulnerability to near field effects would be fairly constrained, in my opinion, in terms of the duration. They may be upstream for 2 years or whatever, as an example that you gave. But the period of vulnerability to the near field effects of the diversion would be considerably shorter. And it would be limited to when they are the early life stages that are mobile, which is, I don't recall exactly, but it may just be days or just a few weeks. And that's because of the screens relative to the size of the fish.
Are relative to the size of the fish. Okay. Are you aware of the discovery or capture of juvenile green sturgeon in the Glenn-Colusa Irrigation District Diversion Canal in 2023?
I'm aware of capture of green sturgeon. I believe we may have to pull up the exhibit, but I believe
I'm happy to. Yeah.
I'm not sure that it was necessarily in the irrigation, the main. I don't know if there was an implication about it being in the main canal, or my recollection was that it was in one of the perhaps associated irrigation canals in the general area, and that the suggestion was that it may have been entrained at Glencalusa Irrigation District.
Okay. Are you aware of whether there are existing screens in place at the diversion point to Glencalusa Irrigation District?
There are.
Do you agree that green sturgeon are more likely than other of these native fish, salmonids or white sturgeon, to become impinged upon screens?
Is the comparison between green sturgeon and salmonids or all other native fish?
Yeah,
I'm
fair
not-
enough. Fair enough. Do you agree that green sturgeon are more likely than white sturgeon to become impinged upon screens?
Objection vague as to location.
Let's start with the location. We'll go from there. Mr. Busher. Please.
In the relevant portion of the Sacramento River, right upstream, do you agree that green sturgeon are more likely than white sturgeon to become impinged upon screens?
They're more likely to occur within that reach of the Sacramento River. Therefore, if impingement could occur, then they would be more likely. Just my understanding is white sturgeon are primarily downstream. Some do occur upstream, but compared to green sturgeon, for which the spawning is generally upstream, or like you say, upstream, perhaps downstream of the intakes, at least one of the intakes. I think the bulk of the white sturgeon are occurring downstream of both intakes, and so the likelihood of near field effects such as impingement would be lower than green sturgeon just on that basis.
Okay, let's try it this way. If we pick a location where the relative abundance of those species is approximately the same, do you have an opinion as to whether green sturgeon are more or less likely than white sturgeon to become impinged on screens?
I would have to look back at the relevant scientific studies that examined the susceptibility. It may be that green sturgeon had higher susceptibility, but I would need to look at the study again just to refresh my memory.
All right, thank you. And same answer if we're comparing green sturgeon and salmonids.
I believe that might be the case. I would probably need to look to refresh my memory on the different criteria.
Thank you. And then last on green sturgeon, I want to talk about the pulse flow protections. Those pulse flow protections for the are designed to protect Chinook salmon, correct?
I believe they're mostly focused on salmon.
Do green sturgeon outmigrating fish respond to pulses or pulse flows?
I think to some extent not necessarily outmigrating per se, but redistribution of the early life stages, maybe in relation to flow pulses.
And what do you mean by redistribution?
Well, for example, after hatching, redistribution to other areas where they may rear longer before they then move downstream. I believe that may be the case, but Dr. Wilder, do you have any more on that? I may be recalling it wrong.
Yeah, there is some evidence that they do migrate downstream in response to higher flows, higher flow events.
And I think, Dr. Greenwood, I took the other part of your answer was that they don't migrate all at once, right? They will move from one stretch of the river to another stretch of the river to another stretch of the river, and then eventually all the way to the delta. Is that correct?
Well, I believe they may do that.
Okay. And is it also correct that the entire population does not necessarily migrate on the same pulse flow events, right? Some of them may go the first time, some of them may not go till the second one.
I'm not recalling if I could specifically answer that.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, could we pull up Baykeeper Exhibit 80, please, 80? Dr. Greenwood, this is a paper by Poitras et al. That I believe is from 2023, maybe 2024. 2024, it looks like. Are you familiar with this paper about juvenile green sturgeon?
I believe I've seen it.
And if we could go to page 7 of the PDF and look at figure 2, and we can start with the caption. And specifically got some questions about the bottom row, figures I through L. So if you want to take a second, Dr. Greenwood, and look at the last sentence of that figure that describes those, please do. You had a chance to review that, Dr. Greenwood?
I have.
So figures I through L show flows as well as the little red pluses, or red crosses are the times when fish started migrations downstream. Do you agree that depicts, right, fish or green sturgeon moving on pulses in flow?
It indicates the last detection in the upper river reach. So to the extent that depending on how a pulse is being characterized, there are some of these crosses that aren't occurring on pulses of flow. Some of them do, some of them don't.
And could we zoom in on figure I, the bottom left one? Or I and J. If we look at I and J, this also depicts that the last time one of these fish was in the upper reach of the river, right, it varies. They didn't all migrate the first time there was a flow event or a pulse event. Some of them waited until much later, correct?
It's the last time, the crosses, I believe, are the last time they were detected. So if that generally represents their last occurrence in that reach, then if they were all released round about the same time, then some would have left at other times than others.
Okay. And is the site's reservoir pulse flow protection designed to ensure that flows of subsequently migrating green sturgeon will not be impacted?
Objection, vague as to timing as to what subsequently is referring to.
I think that's fair. Mr. Busher, will you try that one again?
Dr. Greenwood, I understand that the site's pulse flow protection, right, kicks in and then lasts for 7 days to prevent diversions between 25 and 29,000 CFS, give or take, correct?
It sounds generally correct. I would have to look at the specifics to refresh my memory, but it sounds reasonable.
And then there's a separate threshold for when that protection resets so that it could be re-triggered in the future, correct?
I believe that's correct. Again, I would have to look at the details to refresh my memory.
So if we have a pulse event that qualifies to trigger the protection early in the season, right, and then flows never drop all the way back down to that bottom threshold to re-trigger it, those subsequent pulses after that first 7-day protection are not impacted by the pulse flow diversion criteria, correct?
Sorry. Can you repeat the question?
So once a pulse is initiated, because flows at Bend Bridge are projected to exceed 8,000 CFS, I think, there are restrictions on diversions unless those flows exceed like 29,000 CFS. And those restrictions last for 7 days, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. And then another 7-day protection period cannot be triggered unless the 3-day average of flow at Bend Bridge is less than 7,500 CFS for 7 days, correct?
I would have to look at the description to refresh my memory on it.
and I apologize, I don't have a cite to the description of the diversion criteria. Does that sound generally correct, at least in concept? It has to drop back down below a certain amount before you can trigger another protection.
It sounds generally correct. I might ask Mr. Spranza if happens to know offhand.
That is correct.
Okay. And so long as Sacramento River flows stay above 7,500 CFS, there can never be a second pulse flow protection in that same water year, correct? Either Mr. Spranza or Dr. Greenwood.
I believe that might be correct, but Mr. Spranza, can you confirm?
Yes, that is how it is designed to ensure that the larger pulses that are thought to trigger the movement of fish are protected, and that the reset of 7,500 CFS is where we did establish the point by the flow at which Sacramento River at Bend Bridge would need to achieve prior to resetting pulse protection.
Okay. So if the flows do not drop below that threshold, a second pulse does not have that same limit on diversions that exist in the pulse protection, correct?
Correct. That would not be a qualified pulse event as described in the EIR EIS.
All right, I've just got a couple of last questions here for this panel, I think. Dr. Wilder or Dr. Greenwood, either one of you, although I think this gets back to something that I discussed with Dr. Wilder on Friday. Do you agree that there's a difference between something that is statistically significant and something that is biologically relevant?
Yes.
And so impacts that can be obscured by interannual variability that would not show up as statistically significant can still be big impacts from a biological perspective, correct?
I think, I mean, sure, it's possible. The opposite is possible too. I think I'd need some more specifics to be able to say with confidence.
Well, let me just confirm this then. Do you agree that just because your analysis were to show that something is not statistically significant does not mean that the impact is not potentially important?
Well, statistical significance, takes into account variation, error, things like that. So, we use statistics to help us infer effects. Sometimes it's not always possible to say without a doubt that something is an effect or there's a difference between two results. So we use statistics as a kind of a probability of it being a specific effect.
Okay. Dr. Wilder, have you previously testified before the State Water Board in a water rights hearing?
Yes.
On how many different petitions or applications, right? Different substantive issues?
It was one.
Okay. Have you testified in either state or federal court about impacts to fish and wildlife generally?
No, I have not.
Okay. Have you given under oath testimony to any other regulatory state or federal agency about impacts to fish and wildlife?
I don't believe so.
And was the one other proceeding, what was the one other proceeding?
It was the California Water Fix.
And did you, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, just change in point of diversion hearing.
And that was, well, was your opinion in that proceeding generally that the project would not have unreasonable impacts on fish and wildlife that you analyzed?
As I recall,
Dr. Greenwood, same questions for you. Have you testified in other water rights proceedings?
I have.
Have you testified in either state or federal court about impacts to fish and wildlife?
I have not.
Have you given declarations or deposition testimony in any kind of state or federal litigation on impacts to fish and wildlife?
I don't believe so.
Okay. How many prior water rights proceedings have you testified in?
One.
Also the water fix process?
Correct.
Was your opinion in that case, in that hearing, that there would not be unreasonable impacts to fish and wildlife?
It was.
Have you opined in any other setting that proposed projects or actions in the Bay Delta would have unreasonable impacts on fish and wildlife?
I don't believe so.
Dr. Wilder, have you ever opined in any other setting that a proposed project or action in the Bay Delta would have unreasonable impacts on fish and wildlife?
I have certainly written up results from effects analyses showing what I would consider effects, but I have not, under state water board hearing or other, opined that there were unreasonable effects.
And in those other processes, when you've identified potential effects, have you ever concluded that those potential effects were unreasonable effects on fish and wildlife?
Again, that wasn't the purpose of the analysis. It was more in a biological assessment, Section 7, or EIR, EIS, NEPA-CEQA process.
In either a Section 7 or NEPA-CEQA process, have you ever expressed the opinion that the proposed actions would have unreasonable negative impacts on fish and wildlife?
No, nor was that the purpose.
I think I'm done. Give me a minute. Oh, Dr. Greenwood, I apologize. I meant to ask this and got distracted a couple of times. When we were talking about green sturgeon, you understand that's a federally listed endangered species, correct?
I do.
Thank you. I want to thank the two of you, Dr. Greenwood and Dr. Wilder, for your time, and Mr. Sprans as well, and the rest of you for at least sitting here patiently while I went through that. And that's all the questions I have for this panel.
Thank you, Mr. Busher, and thank you to all the witnesses. We'll certainly take a break, but before I do that, I'll look to the room. Mr. Schutz, are you planning, as far as you know, to be up next for asking questions?
So far as I know, yes.
Okay. Great. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll return at 2:41, and I will turn things over to you, Mr. Schutz.
Thank you.
All right, it's 2:41. We'll see if we get everyone collected back on camera here. And Ms. Cott, are you ready to go back on the record?
Present and ready. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll make sure I'll wait a little bit, see if we get Mr. Hasrick on screen here. Great. I saw Ms. Unger, so I'll go ahead and turn things over to you, Mr. Schutz.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, panelists. My name is Chris Schutz. I'm the Executive Director of the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance, or CSPA, or CSPA as it's sometimes known. CSPA is one of the protestants in this proceeding. I have a series of questions for Mr. Speranza. I have a few for Dr. Greenwood and one follow-up for Dr. Hasrick. Good afternoon, Mr. Speranza. Mr. Speranza, have you personally been involved in governance structures whose purpose was to implement adaptive management of water operations?
Myself as one of the individuals implementing them. Yes. So I haven't been part of I've been part of the science team, but not any higher than that. So I worked on multiple adaptive management programs that looked at water quality and fisheries. Currently working on adaptive management program for environmental flows on the San Juan River in New Mexico. Yeah, so several.
So the level of your participation has been that on, why don't we pull up Sites 275, Mr. Speranza's summary, and look at slide 6, please.
Did you say page 6 or slide 6?
Slide 6 of Sites 275. If we could pull that up, I think it would be helpful. There we go. So looking at the lavender boxes on the right, Mr. Speranza, what I understand you to say is that of the different levels of adaptive management governance that you show here, the level at which you've been a participant would be on the lowest level on the right, the adaptive management science team. Is that correct?
Correct. Although there has been some components of what is identified as the committee, which is coordinate with other programs and such. It's not all are set up this way. So yeah.
Okay. In your experience with adaptive management implementation, have you been aware of situations where what you describe as a governing body has declined to implement the recommendations of what you describe as an adaptive management committee?
I'm trying to recall. I'm sorry. Yes. That's just the one that I can think of is we were working on an adaptive management program to look at the changes in water quality at depth and relation to fisheries. And one of the science team recommendations was to put water quality measuring units every, I can't remember what it was, 5 meters. And I think they were ultimately resolved to, I think, every 3 meters due to costs of the units.
Thank you. Now, what I had asked you before was regarding the implementation by the governing body of a recommendation by the Adaptive Management Committee. What I believe you answered was the recommendation of a science team and how it was responded to by the Adaptive Management Committee. Is that correct?
Yes, you're correct. And I'm sorry for that difference.
That's fine. All right, we'll come back to this, but in the meantime, could we please pull up AHO 301 and turn to page 18, Ms. Mullen? Thank you. AHO 301 is the authority's response to the protest of CSPA et al. And I'd like to call your attention, Mr. Speranza, to lines 5 through 11 of this page, and ask you first, are you familiar with this response?
I'm just reading it, sorry.
That's fine. Take your time.
Yes.
Do you generally agree with this response?
Looking at the results of the model that we used, there was a clear linear flow survival relationship that was a result of that particular model using those particular inputs. And that, yeah, and that overall, and I think I have to remind myself what we based that on. I haven't looked at the model results in a little while, but I think it was cohort replacement, that it did not show a negative cohort replacement ratio, which was where I believe where this particular response was drawn from.
Mr. Speranza, could I be a little more specific with my
Yeah.
question? What specifically I'd like to know is whether you agree that the adaptive management plan may include consideration of in-river flow requirements in light of ongoing research, and that may include bypass flow levels that trigger outmigration of juvenile winter run Chinook salmon. So specifically in regards to adaptive management and what the plan would have, do you agree with this statement?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Speranza, as an environmental scientist, do you agree that the Wilkins Slough bypass flow requirement is an important issue presented in the application and petitions of the site's authority?
I know it's part of the environmental impact report and environmental impact statement. I know it's part of the ITP application. I don't believe it was actually included in the application. However, I do believe it is an important measure in helping out migration of, in this case, salmonids. I'll be specific there, although there could be other ancillary benefits on the Sacramento River.
Okay. I'm looking specifically at the phrase that adaptive management may, quote, include consideration of in-river effects in light of ongoing research. And let's see, that is
looks like
in
6 and
lines
7.
6 and 7, yes.
So adaptive management plan includes considerations of in-river flow requirements in light of ongoing research.
Yes. Do you understand the phrase "in light of ongoing research" to refer to research in general, or do you understand that to mean research designed and conducted specifically for the adaptive management of water operations of the site's authority?
My personal view would be that it would be related research, not just specific to that which is approved by the site's governing body. There are other entities such as Sacramento River Science Partnerships, DWR, and such, who would be initiating studies whose results would likely inform some of our decisions for the project operations base. Yes.
Okay, let's ask it this way. Is it your understanding that development of the adaptive management plan for the site's authority will include consideration of flow requirements for sites diversion?
Beyond what is already identified as 10.7 and the bypasses at the two diversion points, I will say yes, because part of the components of uncertainty that we've already acknowledged is the effectiveness of Wilkins Slough, and as a result, should the studies occur at Wilkins Slough that show substantially different, well, I'm not even going to go there, different results, those would need to be considered by the board and the agency CDFW, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS on the operations of sites.
Okay. Can you tell us, Mr. Speranza, how you would propose to develop a plan in a way that would isolate the effects of sites diversions from other factors that affect migrating fish in the Sacramento River downstream of the site's points of diversion?
Well, we haven't gotten that far yet, and that's a big question. So, how about I start off with a baby step? I would want to know what is the survivability of salmonids. We'll stick there. As they move from above to past the diversions, and I likely also want to know what the survivability difference would be between, say, smolts and fry, or smaller, post smolt, pre-smolts. From there, that would be the first step in better understanding how diversions affect, in this case, salmonids, and it would need to build on that. I mean, that's a big question you asked, Mr. Schultz, and so I tried to give you one solid example. There's going to be a lot.
Okay, you'd agree that it would be challenging, do you not, to tease out what was caused by sites diversions and what were caused by other factors?
I think some components would be challenging, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Speranza, in the context of adaptive management, are you familiar with the term decision space?
Decision space. I may know it by some different definition. If you could define it.
So let's say, for the sake of discussion now, decision space is the range of options accorded to an entity implementing adaptive management to change the management of a project, in this case, the use of water. Do you understand that?
Yes.
So I'd like to ask your professional opinion how much decision space would you recommend for consideration of in-river flow requirements in the site's authority's adaptive management program? And I'm going to give you some examples and ask if this would fall within what you believe is appropriate decision space. This morning, Mr. Busher and Dr. Greenwood discussed Ms. Del Rosario's 2013 paper that suggested that 4,000 cubic meters per second or 14,125 cubic feet per second at Wilkins Slough is a key flow value for migration of winter run Chinook salmon. Would you recommend evaluation of that flow as a possible new numeric flow requirement for the site's diversion?
I wouldn't really recommend one flow. I think we would need to look at a series as you know, Dr. Michelle did and others have. I mean, I can just say now that there should be a range of options looked at by the authority, but we shouldn't go in with any particular number, because if it's 400 cubic meters per second, how much of that is, what's the effect of that, from other sources along the river? It's a very narrow question, and I think
I'm just getting to this.
Comfortable saying that we would go in looking at one particular flow variable.
I just provided that as an example to get a sense of what the range of options you would look at would be. And I'm asking you if that flow level would lie outside the range of options that you would recommend for the adaptive management program for the site's authority project.
I would recommend looking at a range of flows, and 14,000 CFS would be within that range.
Thank you. And going the other end, what would you recommend as the lowest in-river flows for the Sacramento River relative to the site's diversions that the adaptive management plan should consider?
I'm anticipating our ITP to have a minimum of 10,700 CFS at Wilkins Slough when we divert from October 1st, through June 14th. So that would be, I think, a logical minimum to start with for diversion criteria.
So you would not advocate evaluating lower flow values in the event that some finding occurred that suggested a lower flow value was acceptable?
I think that if there was work coming from other scientists, then, as I described in my answer to number one, I would have a range of flows. I stated 14,000 would be in that range, and if we have good research that suggests something lower than 10.7 is actually the best number for reducing, avoiding, or minimizing effects to salmonids, I think it would also be in that range.
Thank you. Mr. Spronza, in your personal experience, have you been aware of situations where entities defer decisions about bypass flow requirements to an adaptive management process or processes to avoid undesired outcomes?
Well, I think the Delta plan is a key example of that. So yes, I am aware of those.
Thank you. Could we go back, Ms. Mullen, please, to sites 275, slide 6? There we go. And calling your attention to the site's authority governing body. You told Mr. Boucher last Friday that the governing body for the site's adaptive management plan would be the board of the site's authority. Is that correct?
That's how I currently envision it, and I think that's how it's currently identified in the adaptive management plan. It's been a while since I looked at the exact terminology that was used.
Would the decision-making authority of the site's authority board be entirely discretionary?
So, as described in my testimony and in the adaptive management plan, the site's project authority would be the decision maker for what management actions, experiments are funded and implemented in any 1 year or 5 year period. So.
What evidence do you think would be necessary to persuade the site's board to increase the flow requirement for sites diversions?
Objection calls for speculation.
Mr. Speranza is the designated expert regarding adaptive management. And certainly one of the things contemplated in adaptive management is changes that might be made pursuant to that adaptive management. I'm asking not, let me ask what type of evidence would be necessary, not what specific evidence, but I think it's within his stated area of expertise.
That's fair. But rephrasing the question with what type of evidence? Do you need the question again?
I do, please. Thank you.
What types of evidence would you think would be necessary to persuade the site's board to increase the flow requirement for sites diversions?
The same objection. I mean, it's asking for speculation as to what might persuade the site's board. That was the basis of my objection on calls for speculation.
Well, let me try thank you, Mr. Hitchings. Let me try the question this way, and then I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Schutz. Mr. Speranza, what types of evidence do you think would be relevant for the board to consider whether or not to increase bypass flows through the adaptive management process?
I think being specific towards Salmonids here, and just because I'm most familiar with Salmonids, I think I think looking at how salmonids survive, well, that's really tough to do too. Here's a simple answer. I think that's good. I think they should consider information that's relevant to how flows in the Sacramento River can most effectively move juvenile salmonids out of the Sacramento River and into the Delta. Well, yeah, let's just leave it there. I'm sorry, it's just a really complicated question, and my mind starts going in a bunch of different ways. But I would certainly look at what the entrainment into the bypasses are, Sutter bypasses are, what the entrainment, into the effect on entrainment into the YOLO bypass. There's a lot of focus on Wilkins Slough, but there's a lot of other items that we've considered in our analyses.
Thank you, Mr. Speranza. I know, Mr. Schutz, that wasn't exactly your question, but I'll hand it back to you to see if you can take it from here.
I think I'll move on to another question. Mr. Speranza, it's the position of the site's authority, is it not, that the enforcement mechanism for the flow requirements for sites diversions would be the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's incidental take permit? Isn't that true?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time? I faded out there for a second. The computer did.
It's the position of the site's authority, is it not, that the enforcement mechanism for the flow requirements for sites diversions would be the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's incidental take permit? Isn't that true?
Yes, and I would add, well, I think that the incidental take permit is probably the most rigorous. So NIMS, National Marine Fisheries Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would also be interested. But the CDFWs, I think, would be, in my view, the most stringent controlling factor. Yes.
Thank you. Isn't it true that the current state administration has been and continues to be an outspoken supporter of the site's reservoir project?
Objection vague.
Mr. Schutz, can you be more specific?
Mr. Speranza, are you aware of the policy statement that Secretary Crowfoot gave at the beginning of this hearing in support of the site's reservoir project?
I'm sorry, folks. I think my computer just disconnected and reconnected. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes,
So
we
I think,
can hear you.
Mr. Schutz, I apologize. I think maybe the question has to go again.
Sorry. Mr. Speranza, are you aware of the policy statement that Secretary Crowfoot gave at the beginning of this proceeding in support of the site's reservoir project?
I am aware of it, yes.
Thank you. And is it your understanding that in making that policy statement, Secretary Crowfoot was speaking on behalf of the Newsom administration?
I would assume so, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Speranza, can you cite to me any situations in California's Central Valley where an adaptive management plan compelled a water user entity to increase long-term regulatory written in-river flow requirements against the will of that water user entity?
I believe that the long-term operations Endangered Species Act, and well, it's been a while since I read that. The adaptive management component, well, I'm going to say no, but I would like the opportunity to revisit this if given once a chance to look at the long-term operations biological opinion and incidental.
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm missing a few words here and there. I'm not sure if that's just, I'm going to say no, but I would like the opportunity to revisit this if.
Once I have an opportunity to review the long-term operations of the Central Valley Project biological opinion and incidental take permit for the State Water Project. I believe there are good management components in there, but I am not 100% certain at this time, as it's been a little while since I reviewed them.
All right, I think we'll leave that for now, and I guess Mr. Spronza could present that on rebuttal if he wanted to. Mr. Spronza, are you generally familiar with temporary urgency change petitions for Delta operations?
Generally, yes.
Do you believe that temporary urgency change petitions are a form of adaptive management?
I don't know that much about them to say yes or no. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Could we please pull up sites 136, page 10? Sites 136 is the Sites Reservoir Project Adaptive Management Plan, and I believe it is part of the incidental take permit application.
That is correct.
Thank you. And if we could focus in, Ms. Mullen, on the last paragraph toward the bottom, not the footnote, but the paragraph itself. Very good. So referring to the sentence that starts on the fourth to last line, reclamation would have the lead role for monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of exchanges for temperature management and for modifying criteria associated with executing exchanges. Do you see that, Mr. Spronza?
I do.
And is it your understanding that adaptive management, such as it occurred regarding operations of Shasta Reservoir in combination with operations of Sites Reservoir would be left, that the decider for such any adaptive management decisions would be the Bureau of Reclamation?
Reclamation owns storage in the reservoir, and they have identified specific benefits of which they would like to use their water stored in the reservoir: temperature management, fall flow stability, spring pulse flow. As I would expect them to be, if not actively measuring, at least provide the site's authority the funding to assess those benefits. Can Sites Reservoir tell Reclamation what to do with their water? No.
All right, thank you. That's all I have for the moment for Mr. Spronza. Thank you very much. Let me find my questions for Dr. Greenwood. Here we are. Good afternoon, Dr. Greenwood. Could we please pull up sites 104, Dr. Greenwood's testimony? And could we please turn to page 9? and I'm looking at the top. That's great. Dr. Greenwood, you state here on lines 3 to 10 of your testimony that the CITES project would have long-term positive effects for salmon. Is that correct?
The results of the winter run Chinook salmon life cycle model suggested the potential for positive effects at 2035 climate, which was analyzed in the incidental take permit application for operations, is a summary of what's stated there. In addition to slightly negative effects with 2020 climate, which is what was used in AHO 078, which is the final EIR EIS.
Thank you. So you state the model output that you looked at. Where can we find in plain English a description of the actions at Shasta Reservoir that will create the purported improvement that is reflected in the winter run Chinook salmon life cycle model?
This would reflect the modeling assumptions, which I believe are described in other parts of the documents that I've referenced there. I think for I would need to double check the ITP application for operations for where that might be described. Typically, we have a modeling assumptions document appendix that would describe what the assumptions are. I don't recall specifically where that would be for the incidental take permit application for operations.
Would the source of the purported improvements reported in the winter run Chinook salmon life cycle model be an input to that model from the calcium modeling?
Not specifically from calcium modeling necessarily. Oh, actually, in fact, I believe, but other models that are analyzing the types of things that are in the winter run Chinook salmon life cycle model. So, for example, river temperature and river flow. Calcium, I think, to some extent feeds into those, but it's ultimately the outputs from different models, I believe, that go into the model itself, the winter run Chinook salmon life cycle model.
Okay, I have to say, I've been looking for a description in various model assumptions of what precise actions were taken in order to create the reported effect that you've reported, that others have reported, and I really haven't found those yet. And I would appreciate more than just a general reference, because I've done a lot of hunting without success. Could we turn please to CITES 120 at PDF page 163? This is part of the description of the this is part of the CITES incidental take permit for operations, correct, Dr. Greenwood?
I believe it's, if you could scroll down, please, to the foot of the page, just so I could make sure. this is the incidental take permit application for operations.
Right. And scrolling back up, please. These description of these various models, this section, if you wish, discusses the various life cycle models the site's authority used in support of its application, correct?
It does.
And these include the iOS model. Could you tell us what iOS stands for, please?
I believe it's integrated oncorhynchus simulation, but I would have to double check that.
Okay, very good. And it's also includes the oncorhynchus Bayesian analysis or OBAN model, correct?
It does.
And the Sacramento River Winter Run Chinook salmon life cycle model, also correct?
It does.
And isn't it true, Dr. Greenwood, that the purported benefits that each of these models shows is based on supposed temperature improvements due to sites Shasta exchanges?
I believe to some degree that's correct.
And can you tell us what other factors went into that?
I'm sorry, other factors went into
The determination of supposed temperature of that you cite. Hold on. Other factors that influenced the outcome of the model output that's given by each of these models, and which claims an improvement due to the model output. So.
I believe the temperature related effect, as far as potentially higher early life stage survival, is the main one, relative to potential negative effects, for example, flow survival relationships for downstream migration.
But you don't know, as you sit here today, what operations specifically these different life cycle models modeled in order to achieve these effects, or do you?
I know generally what was involved. The specifics, I would have to defer to the modelers themselves to get more specific on that. But mentioning exchanges, I believe exchanges were one of the components.
Anything else to your knowledge?
I mean, the overall results reflect the various different criteria that are assumed, for example. So I believe these would have included, to the extent that they're represented in the modeling, for example, the Wilkins Slough bypass flows. Mr. Speranza could perhaps correct my memory on that if I'm not right.
I believe you're correct on that, Marn.
Could we scroll down to page PDF 165? So there, that's fine. Now here's one for the OBAN model that says the results were driven by higher survival in the egg to fry stage under the project relative to existing conditions as a result of cooler water temperatures and slightly higher bend bridge flows under the project. Now that doesn't have anything to do with the bypass flow requirements for diversions, does it, Dr. Greenwood?
those aspects, they don't necessarily have something to do. I think it's I'm not sure exactly how the overall representation of the system is done within the modeling and the extent to which having a 10,700 CFS criterion at Wilkins Slough could relate back to some of the upstream things. But these particular things, I don't believe that they would have direct relationship to Wilkins Slough. But as I say, I'm not sure about the overall system operation, modeling assumptions, and how they might interact.
I see. So if we go back to if we could go back to Sites 104, page 9, is it a fair summary to say that you looked at the model output from various models and made your conclusions? If you scroll down a little more, please. Regarding the potential positive effects based on the model output, but that you don't know the details as you sit here today of what inputs were to those models that produced those positive effects. Is that fair?
I don't know all of the specific details, just my general understanding, and having looked at the different components that come out of the life cycle modeling in terms of the different results, as far as recognizing that there are potential positive effects because of lower temperatures under one scenario relative to another scenario based on the way that the system was modeled, including Sites Reservoir.
Dr. Greenwood, has Reclamation, to your knowledge, made any commitments to implement the actions that would create the modeled purported temperature improvements that you mentioned on page 9 of your testimony?
I'm not aware of commitments per se. It may be a good question for Mr. Speranza, if you have anything else to offer on that.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Has Reclamation, to your knowledge, made any commitments to implement the actions that would create the modeled purported temperature improvements that's mentioned on page 9 of Dr. Greenwood's testimony?
Other than providing the authority a letter identifying a 16% storage in the reservoir, we don't have anything at this particular time.
And so Reclamation, and I guess this is for you again, Mr. Speranza, Reclamation is not under any obligation to implement any specific actions that would achieve the purported temperature improvements reported by Dr. Greenwood. Is that correct?
I believe in Reclamation's it's the report that goes up to Washington. I believe Reclamation has identified what they would like to use their water for, as I stated earlier, and that is identified in their feasibility study. That's what it was, in their final feasibility study. I will add that negotiations on operations is one of the steps that would need to be part of determining the operations of the project, just like we would need an agreement with individuals who own the Knights Landing outfall gate. So these are items that are currently identified as in need to prepare or in preparation, depending upon which we're talking about.
So, Mr. Speranza, reclamation is not actually, at this time at least, under any obligation not to use exchanges with sites reservoirs to prioritize improved water supply deliveries to its contractors in preference to water temperature management actions. Is that correct?
Well, the EIR, and this goes well beyond my area of expertise, but I believe the modeling utilizes reclamation's share of storage to achieve those three benefits. So the EIS, I apologize, federal side of that, identifies that as the project description. So if they want to be part of site's project, their current final EIS that supports feasibility study and whatever action happens in the future identifies those benefits as a requirement under NEPA. They would have to either abandon the NEPA document and redo NEPA or not be part of the project to not have a portion of their water utilized for those benefits.
Okay. I have one question for Dr. Hasrick regarding his 2022 paper. If we could bring that up again, and I don't recall which exhibit it is. It's Baykeeper. Let's see. 28. And if we could turn to page 18, please. And I'm particularly interested in this section here that says management implications. Perhaps we could scroll down a little bit, please. That's fine. Thank you. Dr. Hasrick, in the discussion of management implications here, you say that managers can determine at a given level of annual flow whether a pulse flow is likely to have a measurable effect on the survival of salmon. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is it fair to summarize your conclusion here by saying this? Flow pulses in the Sacramento River in drier years have a greater positive effect on salmon survival than flow pulses in wetter years.
I would agree with that.
And you quantify the magnitude of that, at least for one example, comparing mean annual flow of 600 cubic meters per second versus mean annual flow of 200 cubic meters per second, don't you?
That's correct.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the clarification. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Schutz. I will now look to the room. I think I remember Mr. Spain had questions, but Mr. Spain, do you know, are you next on the list from the collective NGOs?
I could be easily.
If there are no objections, then I will hand things over to you.
Okay.
Then we'll go ahead and do that, and I'll ask my team to bring you up here on the pin.
I'm sorry, Presiding Officer Kinsey, did you just call my name?
No, I did not. I was talking to Mr. Spain.
Oh, Mr. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yep.
So, thank you. Thank you.
And we may want to take a break at some point, but let's go ahead and keep going for a little bit and we'll find a nice spot to take a break. Go ahead, Mr. Spain.
Thank you for your patience, everyone. I know this is sometimes a grinding process. And my questions will be focused primarily on salmon, and they'll be really specific to that. And I'll also do my best to give you room to clarify, to correct, to guide the question into other areas where we get more information. My job here is really to try to understand this. There's thousands of pages to deal with. And I want to understand this from the viewpoint of the fishing industry that we represent, because we are people who live based on salmon seasons. That's our livelihoods. So obviously that's our first priority in what we're doing. And if I could ask Ms. Mullen to bring up the, it would be PCFFA X-1. We filed it a few days ago, and it should be there in our kitty of various documents.
And you said PCFFA-1?
No, X-1.
X-1. Okay, great. For cross, I understand.
Correct.
It might take us a moment to track it down here.
Sure. There we go.
There we go.
A little bit provenance on this one. I could not find this anywhere else in the record, but this comes straight from the Sites Authority final EIR EIS fact sheet. It's a fact sheet called Fisheries. And I think I will address my first questions to Dr. Wilder. If you can blow that up, expand that a little bit so we can see it. And Dr. Wilder, you see that that is a CITES document.
Yes.
If you look in the first section, there are three basic sections in the first page. The one that is in gray under key facts and information. I want to read that and get your comments on that, and we'll do that sort of throughout much of my my questions here. The wording says, the division criteria for CITES Reservoir have been refined in the final environmental impact report / environmental impact statement in parentheses final EIR / EIS in parentheses to be protective of fish and follow the most up-to-date best available science. Quote unquote. I'm reading slowly for the reporter's benefit. The question I have is what are those diversion criteria? Can you give us an overview description of those diversion criteria?
I personally cannot, as I didn't focus on that in my testimony. I'm hoping either Dr. Greenwood or Mr. Speranza could help you out, though.
Dr. Greenwood, can you give us some background as to what these diversion criteria are?
The examples that I cited in my testimony include the what's called the pulse flow protection criteria, Sacramento River, as well as the Wilkins Slough bypass flow criteria that are described at the locations in the documents that I've cross-referenced in my testimony. And so to actually get into more on those ones, I would have to probably look at the original sources that I'm citing.
I can help out if
yes,
that's
Mr.
okay.
Speranza, please.
Sure. So was your question, Mr. Spain, the difference between the draft EIR and the final EIR, or just where we landed in the final EIR for diversion criteria?
where you landed and what diversion criteria have been refined, not so much how the process got there, but where are we now?
Okay. So what's been refined, I'm not gonna go into details, but I'll just tell you that, I'll just tell you that we have changes in the pulse protection, changes in Wilk and Slough. Those are the primary differences between the draft EIR and final EIR. Our diversion criteria, and this is a summary, is we have a bend bridge pulse protection. And if you want a summary of this, it's in table 2.5 of the project description for the final EIR EIS. The bend bridge pulse protection we talked a little bit earlier today about is that we have a precipitation generated pulse event that is to help move salmon out of the upper Sacramento River and past the diversions, assuming that they key in on these initial pulses of water to sort of help them move out. So bend bridge pulse protection. Then we have two existing bypass flows that are more, maybe they're navigation, maybe they're pre-existing, but one is at the Sacramento River at Red Bluff Pumping Plant, and that's a minimum flow of 3,250 CFS before sites can pump. We also have a minimum bypass flow at the Sacramento River at Hamilton City. That's of 4,000 CFS. We also have the 10,700 CFS from October 1st to June 14th. It's 5,000 in September, CFS in September. And then sort of as another larger catch-all, we also have to make sure that our operations are consistent with all applicable laws, regulations, biological opinions, incidental take permits, and court orders at the place in place at the time that our diversions occur. So that is just sort of the general measures. There's a lot more detail which I can't even begin to remember at this point.
Nor can I, which is a problem. Yeah, thank you. A couple of follow-up on questions. What are we talking about in terms of the impact on fall and winter run? As you probably are well aware, fishing industry is dependent primarily on the fall and late fall run, rather than the winter run and spring run. The winter run and spring run, of course, are very depleted. They're both ESA listed, and they become constraints in our fishery. But our major support is the fall run. How would all of these affect the fall run? All of these mitigation measures and diversion criteria.
I'll start with this. There, in what I've looked at in terms of my upstream effects analysis, I see very little impact, positive or negative, on the fall run race.
Are there trade-offs between supplying water for spring run, supplying water for winter run, and less water perhaps as a trade-off for the fall run, or vice versa?
Given differences in timing, I suppose it's a possibility. I don't necessarily see that in the results of my analyses. Overall I see very few effects on any of the races. There are some slight benefits that I see for winter and spring run, especially as it says there in those drier years.
In terms of the the best available science that's mentioned here, what are we talking about? What has changed in the science?
Boy, I don't know. That's a difficult question to answer. There's
Let me ask you a particular. You're familiar, of course, with the Martin model.
yes.
Has that been integrated into these diversion criteria? And if so, how?
Again, I can't answer that. I can tell you we did use it in our analysis of effects of the project. Perhaps Mr. Speranza would be able to add to that.
They passed the buck to you, John.
Yeah, I don't think I can in this case because I'm other than the fact that as Dr. Wilder said, the Anderson Martin was used in as part of the overall analysis for the effects. I'm just not familiar enough with it in detail to say how it could be sort of related to our diversions, other than the fact that I'll leave it there, Mr. Spain. It's a good question. I just don't have the answer.
Yeah, and if I might add, just that
Yes,
the 53 degree Fahrenheit value is it is I believe it's considered in the operations of the project. The modelers would know, again, as Dr. Greenwood mentioned earlier, they're the ones that really put the project together in terms of the modeling. So they really know for sure, but I believe it's in there. I don't know how it wouldn't be.
Okay, thank you. I'm gratified to see that it has been included. It is best available science in my view. A couple of other quick questions here, and then let me move on to the next. If you look in the exhibit, again in the middle section, the middle column, I'll read that too for purposes of the reporter. Exchanges with Shasta Lake and Sites Reservoir would provide additional water supply that can help improve the conditions for fish in the upper Sacramento, especially in dry and critical years. My main question there is, what's this additional water supply, or is this just fancy accounting? What's this additional water?
Mr. Speranza, I think you're best suited to answer that.
Sure.
I pass the buck again to you.
No, it's I think what we're referencing in this is the fact that without construction of the reservoir, reclamation would not have a 16% storage. So 10% is so 150,000. So I don't know, 230,000 acre feet rounding estimate of water that could be used to meet the temperature benefits that they're hoping to achieve with those exchanges.
I understand, I think. In terms of and thank you. In terms of the modeling for how that's going to be used, when would that water supply through the exchanges be available? What times of year? That's important in terms of migration.
Yeah, so exchanges generally take place for temperature. Wow, the modeling team is really the best to answer this. But we do have a little wheel that we use in our EIS EIR that generally identifies exchanges with reclamation it's between April and June. And so that is when the Sites Reservoir would send water down the Sacramento River, and this is being very general, I'm not the modeler, would send water down the Sacramento River, and reclamation would retain that same amount of water in Shasta to preserve the cold pool. And then we would the authority would get repaid for that water or exchange in August, September, when temperatures in the upper Sacramento River are at times where temperature dependent mortality is associated with winter run salmon. And so the cold water that was stored in spring would then be released to help manage those temperatures to help the survivability of the eggs and eggs.
Thank you. Are there temperature triggers for that? And if so, what are they?
I'm not aware of any temperature triggers.
The question is, in general, what events happen to trigger the use of this water? The water will be there, but when will it be used? What circumstances would trigger that? If you know.
I'm not. I don't think I'm comfortable with the intricacies of when the exchanges would occur and when they wouldn't. That really goes to the operations and modeling. I'm sorry, Mr. Spain.
I understand. Dr. Wilder, do you have any information or knowledge about that?
I don't, I'm sorry.
Dr. Greenwood?
I'm afraid I don't.
Okay, I understand. The question also I have is, these criteria were modeled out. Is there a document somewhere, a guidance document, a written guideline anywhere where these kinds of triggering events and criteria are specified?
There is a modeling appendix in the final EIS, EIR. There's also a modeling appendix in the ITP. Those would be where I would start.
In those modelings, of course, this would be through Bureau of Reclamation. What is the assumption of the Bureau's project participation? What percentage?
In the ITP, the percentage, that's a good question. I'm not familiar enough. I know there was a 16%, but again, that's really outside of my area of expertise for this particular testimony. I would refer you really to those appendices because I can see a table in my mind's eye where those things are laid out. I just can't remember them.
Anyone else? Dr. Greenwood?
I would have to look at the same source that Mr. Speranza mentioned.
Okay. Dr. Wilder?
I have nothing to add.
Moving on to the next question. Just below the middle section is a header, project changes to protect fish. And this is the statement. Again, this is the site's authority stating this. Site's reservoir will only divert water from the Sacramento River when, after highly protective fish criteria have been met, quote unquote. What are those highly protective fish criteria? Dr. Weiler, I think you're on top of that one.
Actually, I'm not, but if you meant I was going to pass the buck again to Mr. Speranza, I will certainly do that. Or perhaps Dr. Greenwood as well.
Thank you for my afternoon chuckle. Yes, so we have the diversion criteria that we talked about previously, Mr. Spain. And then as our permits come out, so our state ITP permit for operations, we are anticipating to have some conditions of approval in there that are specific to CISA and operations under the California Endangered Species Act. So those are the types of criteria that I believe that little blurb is referencing.
is there anything in writing that specifies those at this point? Are you aware of any, Mr. Spranza?
That specifies.
These highly protective fish criteria, quote unquote.
Sure. The project description of the final EIR EIS has a very detailed section on our diversion criteria. And then I believe those are the same that are in the ITP application. So those, yes, the project diversion, the project description components, chapter 2, the final EIR EIS is a great place to go look for those.
And you believe that those will become criteria in the permitting?
They are proposed in the operations ITP as such. They have also been approved under California Environmental Quality Act and the National Environmental Policy Act by both Reclamation and the Sites Authority. So they are committed to those as part of the project.
Any comments from Dr. Greenwood on those criteria?
I think what Mr. Spranza indicated is a reasonable summary of how I would characterize it as well.
Mr. Spranza, they're making you do double duty here. Next question is, if you look at the bottom, there's a long paragraph there and a wonderful picture of a salmon. I'll read the section that's relevant for my question. Quote, the authority established a new minimum flow threshold for the Sacramento River before project diversions can occur. This new flow threshold is based on a peer-reviewed scientific study for protecting out-migrating salmon, period, end quote. What are those minimum flow thresholds, and how were they, well, first off, what are they? Can you describe them?
I can field this one if you gentlemen would be all right with that. I think that this is specific to the Wilkins Slough bypass flow. Previous, prior to the Sites Project Authority establishing a minimum bypass flow of 10,700 CFS at Wilkins Slough, I am not aware of any operational requirements of other projects that would have a minimum bypass flow at Wilkins Slough. So it's the addition of that and the solidification of it in our final EIR, EIS, and in our ITP. Before that, there was none that I'm aware of.
Where are those spelled out again?
Chapter 2 of the final EIR, EIS, and I believe it's table 2-5.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Turning to page 3, at the top of page 3, the header here is off-stream storage with fishery benefits. And I'll read the quote that I would like to solicit some comment on. In working with Reclamation, Sites Reservoir would provide fisheries benefits that could increase the population of winter-run Chinook salmon. End of quote. Could you describe those fisheries benefits? And how will they be provided? First off, describe them.
Let's see. Well, you can, we find some small benefits to water temperatures in a couple of our analyses. They're primarily, I guess, summertime benefits in the drier years when temperatures are definitely heating up. So there's some relief to any remnant eggs that are occurring for winter run. One of our models, a SalMod model, shows some reduced mortality for winter run and spring run. I haven't connected the dots, but I'm almost certain it's associated with those temperature reductions.
I could add.
Sure, go for it. Go for it, Dr. Greenwood.
I was just going to mention, based on my written and summary testimony, what I'm familiar with is the results from the winter run Chinook salmon life cycle model, which has a number of different outputs. One of which is escapement of winter run Chinook salmon, so essentially abundance of adults in river. And so, benefit in the sense, if benefit is understood to mean potential positive effect, in relation to outputs like the escapement, then that model suggested that as applied to the scenarios modeled in the ITP application for operations.
And what are we talking about in terms of percentage benefit?
I would, in that particular case, I would need to look back. It's a small single-digit number.
Okay. How would this impact the fall run? Would any of these benefits impact the fall run, either positively or negatively?
In the analyses that I did, I'd say it's very limited, both positive and negative.
Yes, for analyses that I've done as well, again, only small effects. I think, for example, I'm familiar with through delta survival analysis. Again, small negative effects, not necessarily directly related to the drive. Well, I guess big picture related to the driver of potential positive effects to winter run, but a slightly different mechanism. It would be a different mechanism. Sorry, to clarify,
please.
Through delta survival would be something that has a function of flow, largely a function of flow coming into the delta, and so depending on the overlap of fall run Chinook salmon juvenile migration through the delta, there could be a negative effect, but it's generally limited because the largest proportion of juvenile fall run migrating tends to be in the later spring months, at which point sites diversions would tend to be considerably less than they might be in the winter time with higher pulsing flows, for example, because of precipitation events and so on.
Thank you. Any other comments from John? You're silent on this one? My next question is looking down to the middle of this last page.
Actually, let's hold, Mr. Spain. I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. I know we're near the end here, but let's
Sounds good.
5-minute break, and then we'll come back at 4:10. Thanks all.
Sounds good.
All right, I'll look to Ms. Cott. Are you ready to go back on the record?
Yes, thank you for the break.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Spain, I will turn things back to you.
Thank you. And thank you for your patience, everyone. My next question is looking at the same document, third page, about the middle, under key fisheries benefit, the second bullet point. And again, I will read it for purposes of the recorder. Quote, stabilizing flows in the upper Sacramento in the fall to help prevent dewatering of fall-run salmon nests called reds. That's under one of the key fisheries benefits. Describe that. What is that all about? How does that work?
Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't bring this up earlier. I was yeah, it was an oversight, I guess. How dewatering works is when salmon lay eggs in their nest called a red at higher flows, and those flows drop during the period of egg and what we call alevin, or individuals like in the picture you see there with the yolk sac attached to them, but they're a hatched egg. When they are still in the gravel, water or flows can go down such that those nests become dewatered and individuals can desiccate and lead all the way up to mortality of those individuals.
In other words, low flows can cause the dewatering of reds.
It's more of a change in the flow rate from the time the eggs are laid to the duration of that that incubation period.
Okay. Have there been studies or estimates done on what the benefit would be?
We'd have to go back to the actual outputs, the model outputs. But there is a model that is conducted. It's based on some data collected by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Sacramento River. Basically, the flows, the distribution of eggs was, or of nests of reds, was mapped, and a fairly complex study looking at how reductions in flow would expose specific areas of the channel to air was done. And as a result, they were able to estimate the approximate proportion of the total reds in specific reaches of the river would be exposed under different drops in flow.
Wouldn't the diversion of about 1.5 million acre feet also drop the flow and therefore cause problems for some of those fall run reds?
It certainly could. It depends on the timing and where in the river the reds have laid their eggs. I'm sorry, where the adults have laid their eggs and produced their nests.
Will there be some sort of criteria in terms of diversions to prevent the dewatering of those reds? Some sort of limitation?
I believe, and at the risk of sounding like a talk show host, I might need to go back to Mr. Spronza for this because he's much more familiar with the criteria than I am. But I believe there are some criteria for stabilizing flows in the fall months.
Mr. Spronza?
Yes, sorry. So the fall flow stability is part of what reclamation's water, but they are intending to use their water for. With respect to specific criteria to prevent that, I haven't seen how Wilkins Slough and how Wilkins Slough bypass flows would affect those reds that are near our diversions. Many, especially winter run, but sorry, we were talking late fall. Much of the spawning within the Sacramento River is above our diversions. And so I have not seen the relationship between Wilkins flew at 10.7 back to relate that to fall red dewatering. That sure someone's looked at that, but I didn't do the analyses, so that's not something I'm familiar with. Sorry for the lack of detail.
Well, thank you for your answer. I'm done with that particular exhibit. If you could bring up sites 07017C, that is Dr. Wilder's testimony. So you get a chance to answer some of these questions, Dr. Wilder. And please look on PDF page 5, and I will move to 6 as well. I have a question on some of the estimates. You say something is not adverse, not unreasonable. That's a value judgment, isn't it? It's clearly not a percentage. It's not a numerical or quantitative estimate. It's a value judgment, correct?
It's kind of a mix. It is based on quantitative values, but it's also based on my experience in conducting these analyses for 15 years and being able to assess what an effect I believe an effect is versus not.
If there's quantitative modeling, of course. I've seen much of that there. At what percentage point does it become unreasonable? Do you have a definition of what unreasonable or adverse means?
Well, adverse with respect to an EIS is, I believe it's defined in, federal regulations. But in terms of unreasonable, to me, it's when an effect or when a project causes a substantial effect that's persistent, sizable, and would impact the population to have a population level effect.
Would it have to have a population level effect to be adverse? Wouldn't adverse be a lower bar than whole population effect?
Potentially, yes.
If you have, admittedly, your modeling shows that many of these impacts are single-digit percentage points. What troubles me is that most of them are negative, and that I would call adverse. Do you disagree?
I disagree that most of them are negative, and you may be looking at a specific type of analysis or model output, but taken on the whole, I don't think I would disagree that they're predominantly negative.
Well, for instance, habitat loss. I don't know if that we need to put it up, but there was a table 11J5 that showed 4.9, 5.2 bench habitat loss. Would that be adverse in your view?
Well, I unfortunately I didn't do that analysis. Dr. Greenwood discussed it earlier. Perhaps he can chime in here.
Dr. Greenwood?
I would describe it as a negative effect with
Okay.
reference to the specific percentage, difference that there is associated with it. But as far as adverse or unreasonable, I think we're, at least if I was using those terms, which I have used, similar terminology in my testimony, really I'm thinking about as a whole, in relation to overall considerations, would a negative effect of that magnitude be adverse or unreasonable to these populations? And I'm sorry, I don't recall my specific language on it. We would have to look at it, but that was in relation to riparian wetland bench habitat in the delta, I believe, that was discussed earlier today. And so,
Okay.
there is some context needed as far as different environmental regulations that we might be thinking about in terms of the different conclusions that we might reach. But ultimately, in that particular example, what helped me to, or what my overall opinion regarding the project is related to, is that that's acknowledged as a negative effect that under the California Endangered Species Act requires full mitigation, and therefore mitigation is proposed to address that effect.
In terms of the riparian loss, the bench habitat, I think there was some discussion earlier when Mr. Schutz was asking this question. What mitigations are proposed?
We'd have to pull up the specifics on it. I don't recall if the language mentions either the potential for purchase of credits or whether there's actual, construction or reconfiguration of existing areas to increase the habitat value. I'd have to double check the area that the specific part that I've cross-referenced there.
Is that anywhere in the operations plans?
It would be written in the ITP application for operations at the location that I've cited in my written testimony.
Okay. So there are some plans that the authority has for mitigation measures to try to offset lost habitat. Is that correct?
There are some.
But is it also correct that that's not a fully finished product?
The mitigation measures, the general descriptions are included, but those typically then lead to a lot more consideration in terms of, for example, during permitting processes, what the requirements may be for if there might be monitoring associated that, for example, to assess whether the habitat is, properly functioning based on its mitigative function that's intended, that type of thing. So at this point in time, and Mr. Speranza can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I don't believe that we have detail like that in the documentation currently.
We don't have detail. We have options because right now we're at a planning. We're just going from a planning phase to the initial permitting and maybe some implementation. But what I can tell you is that the mitigation approaches are a variety of them. Everything from on-site restoration to turnkey banks to sites authority responsible mitigation, compensatory mitigation that would be located off site, so out of the project footprint. The amounts of mitigation that we've currently expanding on a question that you would ask earlier. I just happen to know this. With respect to winter run and spring run Chinook, we're looking somewhere around 4.5 acres, 4.6 acres of wetland bench habitat that would need mitigation for. I think that answers the question that you'd asked previously too.
And is there specific mitigation for the fall run, either fall or late fall, or both?
We don't have that specifically within the ITP because it's not a managed species. However, and Dr. Wilder and Dr. Greenwood would likely be the best to confirm this, I would estimate that mitigation with respect to wetland bench and or channel margin rearing habitat for winter run and spring one would also be within the habitat range utilized by fall run and late fall run salmonids.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Wilder, when you say something is unreasonable, you're comparing one set to another, sort of a before and after. You're comparing with project to without project. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Did you do any analysis of intergenerational replacement rates or anything like that? In other words, are we going to get enough fish in the next generation to replace this generation and do that indefinitely?
Not directly. I believe the life cycle models that we conducted do provide numbers of fish year over year, and it's modeled throughout the entire hydrologic period, which is 82 years of historical, 1929, I believe, to 2003.
That's
So
Salmod?
that would not be Salmod specifically. I'm specifically referring to the IOS or IOS, the Oban, and the winter run life cycle model.
Yeah, I understand that what you're doing is comparing no project to project. That's correct in terms of the modeling, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But the status quo, that is no action. Two of those fish runs, the winter run and the spring run, are ESA listed. One at the highest level of protection, that is the winter run, is endangered. If you're modeling that and there's a minor negative change for those runs, you're having a negative change on an already ESA listed species. Is that correct?
Yeah. On an absolute level, yes. However, because of the way the calcium model works, and because of the way we intend to do the analysis, everything is relative to that baseline. So we provide our results relative to that baseline only.
And you'll agree that that baseline includes ESA listed winter run and ESA listed spring run, correct?
Yes.
Okay. We may disagree what where you draw the line reasonable, but I understand. I think we're on the same page in terms of the numbers. One last little bit here. If you could put up sites 275. It's John Spranz's summary, page 5. Yes. Very good. I'm going to deal with the first two bullet points there. They're very interesting to me. The validity of modeling assumptions and the results used in project planning and environmental review. Let me follow up on a comment you made, Mr. Spranza. Something to the effect that all models have uncertainty. Would you tell me what you meant by that? You're muted, Mr. Spranza.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, but I just caveated that I'm not a modeling expert, but it's my understanding that as simulations of events, that all models that I'm aware of have some inherent uncertainty associated with them. There's a good example of this was we were discussing earlier Dr. Michel's step function, and I brought up the variability in that step function and the confidence intervals that identify that 95% of the projected response falls within a certain range, and that range is the level of error. It goes into way more details and statistics than I could ever possibly dive into.
But thank you. I think that's a good overview. I want to ask Dr. Wilder a few things about the models. You've got models like CalSim2 is the primary model, right? That you use for most of the Sacramento, Feather River, and American rivers.
That's right. It provides the kind of the first step in all of the subsequent analyses.
And that's based on monthly flows, I take it.
It is.
If you have sudden spikes in temperature, for instance, another heat wave, another heat dome, that might be one-off event in a month of otherwise normal weather. Is that correct?
Yes.
We've seen that, in fact. Wouldn't a monthly flow where you're averaging all the flows of a month sort of hide that? Would it disguise that impact?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, there's more variation daily than when you take just a single point as an average. There's always variation around a mean. So yes.
Mhm. But as you know, salmonids are very temperature sensitive. If you wind up with a heat dome event, and we've seen that more and more common under climate change issues, you could have a major fish kill based on that spike. Is that correct?
Yes.
We've seen it, yes. But it wouldn't necessarily come out in the calcium monthly flows because it would be averaged out of the temperatures. Is that correct?
That's correct. But I want to add well, I'll let you continue, and I may want to say a couple things at the end.
I welcome it. Would you call that one of the uncertainties in the model? The CalSim2 model?
I would probably characterize it as a limitation rather than an
Okay.
uncertainty.
Fair enough. Fair enough. You had something to add?
Yes. First of all, specific to temperature, we do have a daily temperature model for the Sacramento and American rivers. You have to proceed with caution when using it, otherwise the modelers will start yelling at you. But it is a daily model, so it does account for these smaller temporal scale variations.
Is that HEC 5Q?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trying to think of the other thing. I acknowledge your point that if you do have a single day that is extremely hot, it tends to get washed out in an average over a month. However, in doing the comparative analysis that we do, we would expect that single day would be washed out under both the project and the no action day monthly mean. So, that's about as good as we can do to account for that when all we're given our monthly outputs.
And you're familiar with the Upper Sacramento River daily operations model?
Yes.
Daily flows Sacramento River, according to your summary here.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
It's a model that was used in limiting amounts. I believe the modelers had indicated that it's more limited than something like the HEC5Q model. We used it for things that you wouldn't be able to make any sense of anything if it weren't at a daily time step. So getting back to the red dewatering that we were talking about, a monthly flow value is very, it's not useful when you're trying to look at differences, drops in flow or over, a couple months period.
What sort of uses is it put to generally? In this context in the project?
Yeah, I believe we used it for red dewatering and juvenile stranding. There may have been some other uses. Dr. Unger may be able to fill in some of the gaps that I'm not thinking of right now.
Sure. The other one is red scour analysis. We used it for that.
And you mentioned HEC5Q. That doesn't come trippingly off the tongue, but I'm using notes. Tell me a little bit about that and some of the limitations as well as the uses of that model.
Yeah, we
let's
use
start
it.
With let's start with the uses.
Sure, we use it for essentially all, I believe, of the water temperature analyses in the Sacramento and American rivers. As far as limitations, I'm not an expert in the inner workings of the model itself, but it is based. We get monthly water temperatures, and then the modelers pattern daily historical daily values to try to characterize the daily outputs that end up in the model itself. So it's kind of a reincarnation of historical peaks and troughs in temperatures, or just variation in temperature that are applied to a monthly time step. And the mean of that variation within each month is what the monthly temperature output is from, they originally work with. I hope that made sense.
I think it did. What are some of the limitations of that model?
Again, I think it's that it's based on this historical record, and there's no guarantee that the temperature on a specific day is going to be what it was historically. It's not meant to be that way. It's meant to just take advantage of the variation that we found historically and apply it to those individual days in the past.
Hindcasting, in other words.
Yes.
Yeah, we sort of have to do that. But what about climate change? How are you factoring in climate change variables in all of this? It creates a great deal of uncertainty. How is the project factoring that in? Dr. Wilder, you're probably an expert on that after all.
You're going to hate this, but I'm probably going to have to pass this to Mr. Speranza, because but I will tell you that we I believe are going to be looking at some, or maybe we have looked at some future climate change scenarios using model outputs of those scenarios. But I'll stop there in case I say too much. I don't want to say something that's not true.
No, I think that's accurate. So accounting for climate change. One of the reasons that the project's being built is to adapt for climate change. As many folks know, our current system within California is designed around capturing slow snow melt behind rim dams, and then slowly metering that out to meet all the demands that are on that water, whether it's agricultural, environmental, municipal. Future climate scenarios and models have shown that we are going to be shifting when our precipitation occurs. It's going to be coming slightly sooner. And it's also more will be falling in the form of rain rather than snow. And so this project, which diverts flows that are within the winter time, these higher flows that come in that are not historically captured or designed to be captured, I think, by the rim dams. The project is designed to take those flows and store them so that then the storage partners, including Reclamation and the state of California, can then use that water during periods of high demand or low water availability. That's really, I think, one of the stated purposes of the project. So that's one way, Mr. Spade. Hopefully that was understandable and sufficient.
Thank you. It's very helpful. One last couple of questions here. In the modeling, particularly Dr. Weiler, maybe you can answer this, Dr. Greenwood. In the modeling, what are the confidence levels in those models that you're using? There's never any error bars there in any of the stuff that I've been seeing. There are uncertainties. You acknowledge that there are uncertainties. That means there should be some level, some measurement of confidence levels. Where are those?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's certainly acknowledgement that there is uncertainty in the models and all the limitations that go with it. It's a coarse representation of project operations, generalized rules, et cetera, et cetera. But the modelers are unable to give us specific values for those confidence intervals. And I don't pretend to understand it. Dr. Greenwood probably understands it better than I do. But it's a limitation of the model that we're unable to get these error bars or confidence intervals.
Yeah, and if you have a model and you're using the model outputs to be the inputs of yet another model, is that basically expanding the potential error, expanding the confidence bars?
Yes, you're correct.
Yeah. One last thing. In terms of bullet number 2 here, effectiveness of the Shasta Reservoir water exchange for its intended purpose. Temperature management, spring pulse flow, fall flow stability. Let me see if I heard correctly that there is no written guideline or commitment to any particular criteria or trigger points or operations to make sure that those things are accounted for at this point. Is that correct? I think, Mr. Spranza, you probably will have to answer this one too.
Sure. So we do have a couple things that we can point to, one of which is as I mentioned earlier, the project description in the final EIS, which is Reclamation's environmental document that identifies those three as uses of the water. And so should, as well as their feasibility study that they sent up to Washington and for approval. So that I think is pretty solid. I would also say that Reclamation for some time has had a temperature management strategy on the Sacramento River as a requirement of its biological opinions. I would anticipate that that is also something that is pretty, that is a firm document, and reclamation would need to meet the temperature requirements, and as identified in their Endangered Species Act permit. So I think those are two areas. Again, Mr. Sping, the agreements with Bureau of Reclamation are something that is pending, and I think Reclamation is they're in the decision-making process, and they will need to talk to the authority and negotiate all that out. But I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. All this has been very helpful. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Andy, also for not raising a single objection. Much appreciated. And I am finished with my questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Spain. It's 4:47, so I think we'll hold it at that, but I'll look before we break. I will look to the room. I know, Mr. Fisher, you had indicated you had some additional questions. Is there anyone else from the coordinating NGO parties, as I've called you, who has questions for this panel?
This is Don Mooney. I'll have a few.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Mooney. So my inclination would be in the morning to start with you, Mr. Mooney, and then go to Mr. Fisher.
Fine.
Great. So you're prepared. Are there any other procedural issues we should, not tomorrow, Wednesday, when we meet again? Are there any other procedural issues we should all address before we break until Wednesday morning?
I do have a request, Ms. Kinsey.
Yes.
I'd like to request permission that we switch the order of panels 8 and 9. Corey Matsui, who is on panel 8, is not available starting Wednesday afternoon through Monday all day. And so we'd like to move the tribal panel ahead of the greenhouse gas panel in order to allow Mr. Matsui to be available to come Tuesday, which is when we would anticipate, we might get to that panel if we're able to put the tribal panel ahead of the greenhouse gas panel.
So normally I would have no problem with that. Here is the rub. I have been asked explicitly so Wednesday, and this is my error. Wednesday, I managed to schedule us on a hearing day on a day that's also a board meeting day, which means the board members are not able to attend the hearing. I believe the board members have a specific interest in panel 9, which leads to my hesitation to schedule them for Wednesday when they won't be available. Is there another alternative where we can switch? I know you're juggling witness availability as well.
Well, I guess we could try to move panel 10 up, maybe to Wednesday, and then take panel 9 on Monday. Assuming all this plays out, that we get,
right.
And maybe we can have a conversation about expected cross for the terrestrial panel in a minute, but we could potentially move panel 10 up ahead of both 8 and 9 to try to put the tribal panel on no earlier than Monday.
Let's consider that. But maybe let me look to the room. We have 10 more minutes, so we can do this. On panel 7, which is the terrestrial species panel, do I have that? Am I right?
Yes.
Great. I'll look around to see how much cross we expect. So I'll look to the NGO collective. Maybe I'll start with Mr. Busher if you're here, because you are a lead. Or Mr. Mooney, do you have an estimate on cross for the panel 7?
I Probably, well, my part's going to be about an hour and probably an hour and a half, but I'm not sure about anybody else with NGOs. So.
Let me look to the.
This is Eric Busher for Baykeeper. I would expect that Mr. Mooney is the bulk of the group's cross-examination.
Okay. And then for my benefit, Mr. Ferguson, can you remind me how long, or maybe you haven't told me, how much time, yeah, I think you have, how much time you expect for putting on summaries of direct testimony for panel 7? It's 2 witnesses, right?
Probably
30 to 40.
30 to 40 minutes.
Okay. And we still have some time. And then are there other parties who are on the call who are going to have expect to have cross-examination of more than a few minutes on the terrestrial species panel?
Ms. Kinsey, this is Ben King. So I submitted some questions to you, whether or not you allow them or not, probably be about 15 minutes.
Great, thank you.
But also,
Sounds like,
can
sorry,
I
go
also
ahead.
mention on the tribal engagement panel, I think it's probably important just to let the tribal parties, since they just joined, which date that's going to be, and be certain about that. So if it's going to be Monday, if everybody knows it's Monday, since that's one they probably want to engage.
Yes, yes, thank you. We're juggling a lot of pieces here. It sounds to me like panel 7 will be a little over maybe 2.5 hours. 2.5. We have a fair some left for our current panel 6. But it does seem like we would get to, if I'm doing the math correctly, very quickly, it does seem like we'll get to another panel. I mean, the other option is to try to, I'm not sure we can get to panel 8 in the morning. Otherwise, I would say, well, let's do it in the morning, but it sounds like that might be a little tight.
Yeah, it does to me too.
Yeah, so maybe let's plan for, if that, I know you may have to check with your witnesses, but if we can move panel 10 up to Wednesday.
Okay.
Let's plan on that, and then we will put, maybe I'll go ahead and make the call. Let's do panel 9 on, I hate to reorder us, but there is some element of having everyone on notice. Let's go ahead with panel 9 on, we'll plan for it to at least start on Monday. Let's see, Monday the 23rd. And then hopefully that would finish on the 24th.
Yeah, thank you for the accommodation. I apologize for kind of doing this, what probably seems like last minute, but we were just not certain when that was going to pop up and thought it wouldn't come till later. And
Right. And then it comes up. No, we're all juggling a lot of people. So I appreciate everyone's flexibility and communication with me.
Okay.
And your understanding on my end as well. Does that clarify? Was I clear enough on how we're going to do things? All right, good, great. With that, is there anything else we need to address in the last 5 minutes? All right, well, thank you so much once again. Thank you to all the witnesses for a long day. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you for your professionalism once again. And I'll see you on Wednesday morning. We're adjourned for the day.
Ms. Kinsey?
Yes.
It's the court reporter.
Yes.
Just to let you know that another reporter will be here on Wednesday. I'll be back next week. Just wanted to
great
update you on that.
Thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate that update.
Okay, thank you.